Hello and welcome back. I know a lot of people on the channel have enjoyed these now and then types of videos, so I wanted to make a fun video about aspects of gaming that younger gamers are unlikely to have ever experienced, understood, appreciated, hated, and so on. I do not have a strong definition of younger gamer, but all the items on this list are going to probably be memory bombs for older gamers that anyone born this century is likely just to think of as legend or mythology. Now, whether you're a younger gamer or an older gamer, let's dig into 12 things younger gamers might never get to experience with modern gaming. Konami code, anyone? The 20th century, I remember, was just littered with secret passwords that led to all these secret levels, infinite lives, and tons of fun stuff, like giant heads, for example. We were really all excited to find and utilize these codes, and most games seemed to have them back then. Well, I wouldn't say most, but maybe many. However, back then you really had to find them via word of mouth, magazines, sketchy chat rooms, or just literally by blind luck. The Konami code is probably the most famous of them, found in Contra on the NES, but I specifically remember all these awesome codes in games like NFL Blitz and how they affected the gameplay, as well as games like I think Primal Rage, if I remember right, for the Super Nintendo, that fighting game with the dinosaurs. Tons of games had codes that could make the games easier or alter it in hilarious ways. There was even actually a market for cheats in code devices. Some gamers might remember the game Genie or the game Shark. They were literally physical devices you could plug in, if I recall, that allowed you to access cheats for games on the respective console you had. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't really dabble in the physical cheat devices much, but I do remember how much fun it was to discover codes in games. And honestly, it's a giant feature of 20th century gaming that has pretty much just disappeared from games, except for maybe a couple series like I believe Grand Theft Auto and Mortal Kombat might be two of the long-running series that might be keeping cheat codes alive to some extent, but for the most part, all these weird settings and gameplay options are generally buried in your settings menus in modern games. This one's a weird one. Save points still do exist in a scattered form, but honestly, the concepts of hard save points for everything pretty much disappeared when CD-based games could save internally on consoles rather than require an exterior device, like a memory card for example, to save the game. I really do like my old PS2 memory cards. I still have a PS2, and I really like turning them on and looking at all those cute little icons that I have for each game, but I absolutely do not miss corrupted files on third-party memory cards or losing hours of progress. I remember when I first got Final Fantasy VIII, I had this horrible third-party memory card that just deleted my hours of progress multiple times before I was smart enough to get a Sony one. And now with modern gaming, autosaves have just become the norm, and even most retro remasters and remakes use autosaves at this point. The only game I can really think of that forced me to hard save in the last couple of years that's a modern game is the Silent Hill 2 remake. And I think that still had autosaves, just more sparse than maybe the average game. So young people will rarely, if ever, get the pleasure of seeing hours of progress lost due to a power outage or a corrupted file or a game over. And that's just unfair. I feel like I was seriously a guinea pig that gave you youngsters the ability to skip all these bad things, but memory cards were pretty cool. My recent interest in the Tomb Raider HD collections for those original games on the PS1 and 2 did bring me back to playing the original game on the Saturn when I was way too young to know what to do. I explored the cave in the first stage endlessly, and I never beat the cave until I eventually got a PS1 instead and didn't return to Tomb Raider until Lost Revelation, or whatever the fourth one is called. But this wasn't a rare experience back then. If you wanted to figure out how to overcome hard puzzles or bosses, or just figure out how to even play a game sometimes, you were supposed to possess Lara Croftian tank control level patience or buy a strategy guide. Or in some cases you read the manual, which is also something people don't have nowadays. I do have mixed feelings on all this because I no longer really have time to spend hours and hours and hours running around a cave level and trying to figure out what to do. But I do think that the constant waypoint in open world games has definitely killed some of the sense of exploration and wonder. Young gamers, I will defend you a bit though. I do think modern game convenience is nice, especially since old games like Tomb Raider had one very specific thing you needed to do to beat the stage. It wasn't as if your creativity and ingenuity would allow you to actually beat the level, but instead, it was just a maddening showdown with one cryptic objective with a very specific and cryptic solution. Tomb Raider wasn't alone though. Probably the most famous example I can think of that's criminal here is Castlevania 2 on the original Nintendo Entertainment System, a painfully slow adventure with cryptic hints that expect you to turn a garbled phrase into using a very specific item when you're bending down in a very specific location. Tell me you don't need a guide for that. Now, exempting Nintendo, most consoles nowadays don't really differ a ton in their physical features and capabilities. I mean, yeah, there's exclusives and the subscription services differ a bit, but any modern game can virtually be played on any console with very limited differences. Older gamers are going to remember a time when consoles differed so much that it completely altered your experience. Think about the Genesis's boomy sound chip versus the kind of more airy, symphonic Super Nintendo one. Or think about, Nintendo 64's polygonal characters in a game like Banjo-Kazooie compared to the blocky Final Fantasy VII characters on the PS1. Or remember how infamously huge the original Xbox One's controller was? Sorry, Xbox, not Xbox One. Next to the teeny tiny GameCube controller? Yeah. Consoles were a really, really big deal, and which one you chose really rested on your personality and preferences. Nowadays though, unless you really want to play certain exclusives, your experience, whether you're on an Xbox or a PS5 or Steam, will basically be indecipherable for most games.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
I just had to include this on the list. Despite the fact that I do really enjoy many new games, I constantly hear older gamers say that new games just aren't that innovative. They don't take enough risks, they feel formulaic. I agree and disagree here. I think selling a $70 game is incredibly difficult, and gamers today are accustomed and want bigger worlds, more hours, cinematic tales, extra DLC and replayability, and robust online features. And I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the games on something like a Nintendo Entertainment System or a Sega Genesis would feel like a wonky indie game by today's standards. However, it is also true that a lot of daring games paved the way for a console success in days of yore. I'm thinking about how much fun Punch-Out was for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Or, how much Mega Man X turned into a system seller for the Super Nintendo. And Sega's consoles were always loaded with just amazing yet bizarre games, everything from Dynamite Headdy to Guardian Heroes to Rez. All of these games are truly amazing, yet none of them would ever be made by AAA developers today because they would fear that they could not charge full price or could not make enough profits. I guess indie games have kind of filled the gap pretty well, and there are admittedly still occasionally some really unique games that just stand out amongst the crowd, but no doubt that the industry has grown up and the majority of AAA games, exempting maybe Nintendo here, are incredibly, big, cinematic, tight, like Elden Ring games or like Uncharted types of games. Sega. Sega is still a household name if you're into the modern gaming world, and their partnership with Atlus and the Persona series has definitely brought them some phenomenal success, not to mention all those Sonic movies and kind of new games that have come out. But legends do suggest they once made consoles and had the opportunity to dethrone Nintendo and Sony. But the rest is history, and it has been over 2 decades since Sega was in the console game. Now, I was a Super Nintendo kid. I think if you watch my other videos, you probably know that. But the Genesis was a massive success, and I have really fond memories of playing the console at friends' houses. The little black console did so well in North America that there's a good chance that just about every 90s kid played it at least once. And moving on to the Saturn, while commercially a failure, still had a ton of good games, and the Dreamcast was a console that many thought would catapult Sega back on top. Modern kids, you will never know just how daring and innovative Sega was, with stuff like being able to watch TV on a Game Gear, getting free streaming via Sega Channel on their Genesis, having arguably the best light gun game selection on the Saturn, or featuring maybe the very first MMORPG on the Dreamcast. No matter what your thoughts are on Sega, no doubt they were a game changer in the industry, and nobody born in this century got to live through their glory days. Old manuals, yes, I have very, very fond memories of taking public transportation to the mall with my friend to grab a new game and then browsing our new manuals in wonder for the whole ride back. I mean, practically salivating to pop the game in when we get home. It was magical, truly. And nowadays, almost no games come with manuals. I mean, if they do, it's like a tiny little pamphlet type thing. And I need to be honest, I like to grab retro games off my shelf occasionally and just browse the manuals for fun, and it makes me a little sad that I can't do that with my Switch games, for example. I get that physical media is becoming less and less of a thing, but I mean, that tactile experience of a manual and getting to read that before we pick up the game is just something that most young gamers probably will never think about, and that makes me kind of sad because I do have so many good memories linked to that. This one was a little hard to think about, but simple ports being exciting isn't really a thing anymore. We live in a paradise of game availability. I mean, there's so many options. Take a game like Super Mario Bros. 3 from the Nintendo Entertainment System. I mean, you could play it on your NES, your SNES, SNES, Super Nintendo, via Mario All-Stars, the Game Boy Advance, an emulator, online services on virtually any new Nintendo console since the Wii. But I still remember how exciting it was to get this game on the Game Boy Advance. Like, what? I can now take Mario 3 on the go with me instead of dusting off my old Super Nintendo cart? And for the mere price of $35, younger gamers generally don't need to pay full price for ports anymore. There's remasters or remakes, yes, but they generally add a lot of quality of life updates or include multiple games from the franchise. But that was what the times were back then. We were genuinely just blown away when games hopped consoles. I mean, the Mega Man Anniversary collections on PS2 were breathtaking. I had never thought that I would literally get all the best Mega Man games in 2 PS2 discs. It was just incredible. And now that's kind of just the standard. There are some games that would definitely surprise me, like Panzer Dragoon Saga would genuinely shock me. I'm just not going to hold my breath on that. But I mean, the thing is, I can hop on my computer right now and emulate it, which would not have been possible 20 years ago.
So this is Star Fox. I'm going to crush you.
3D was once so exciting. Younger gamers, I mean, you may have seen a couple smaller jumps of stuff like the 360 to the Xbox One or the PS4 to 5, but that truly just does not compare to how wild a concept 3D was in the 90s to mid-2000s. A lot of games originally faked it, stuff like kind of Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo with F-Zero, and it looked amazing at the time. Then there were these just stunning arcade achievements like Virtua Racing, which is blocky and polygonal, but in the early 90s that was mind-blowing. And then consoles finally managed to reach kind of the 3D mark successfully, I will say, with the PS1 and the N64. So imagine what people thought when they saw something like Sonic Adventure or Final Fantasy X for the first time. I mean, I was there and it was freaking mind-blowing, seriously. I don't want to minimize modern graphical achievements though. The uncanny valley of the early 2010s is really finally giving way to lifelike characters with just amazingly detailed and accurate facial features and expressions, but the 3D changes we older gamers grew up with changed the entire game. And by that I mean the industry. New controllers had to meet the demands of 3D navigation, control schemes needed to be figured out, developers needed to work around just fierce console limitations, and series lived or died based on whether or not they could adapt to a new 3D world and that game design that came with it. Please insert disc 2. Okay, I don't actually really miss this that much, but old game discs often could not store a full game, especially when they were loaded with stuff like FMV videos. What comes to mind for me is Squaresoft's PS1 RPGs, like all their Final Fantasy games. They usually spanned multiple discs, like 3 or 4 of them. What does remain, though, is that I still talk to old friends using this lingo. Like, a friend might ask me, oh man, you're playing Final Fantasy VIII, where are you in the game? And I'm going to be like, oh, I'm in the beginning of Disc 2 in the desert prison, despite the fact that I'm playing this game entirely on my digital version on the Switch. I just can't quite get those discs out of my mind since that's how I experienced the games. I mean, discs gave us markers on how much progress we had, and we do associate a lot of gameplay memories with those discs. And honestly, if you were lucky, those discs had really cool art and featured different characters and were really fun to look at. Yeah, there was definitely a period when going to the game shop felt truly adventurous. Now, I was a kid in the 90s, and except for very rare occasions where I knew a big release was coming, I often walked into a GameStop or EB Games and just bought a mystery game. I would buy something usually based on maybe the company that developed it, or the series I tried before, the genre. or even sometimes a customer service rep's opinion. I mean, I would not have bought games like Vandal Hearts 2 and Legend of Dragoon on PS1 if it were not for this one GameStop employee who was a huge RPG nerd giving me the spiel on how awesome they were. That said, though, I did get duds, and it wasn't always an amazing experience, but it was really cool to buy games that were just new and fascinating to run into without any kind of preconceived notion on them. I mean, I did pick up Resident Evil Survivor. Ugh. Anyway, part of this is probably being a kid versus an adult. I'm sure there probably were gamer adults in the 90s who just knew the release schedule. But I mean, you needed to use word of mouth or like dial-up internet or magazines, and those magazines only came like once a month. Just compare that to now, where you never truly need to play a bad game or take a risk. You can just pull up a review in mere seconds on YouTube or Google. You can see a release schedule in seconds, and you can watch events like Nintendo Directs to figure out what to buy. There's a lot of pros to this, yes, but I do feel a little icky about needing to watch 3 reviews and just trusting the mass opinion on games, rather than kind of just trying stuff out for myself and forming my own opinion. I saved the best for last here, and unless you have a cool relative who decided to hand you their old like Super Nintendo collection or something, younger gamers may never experience what it's like to blow into a cartridge. Forget this actually being bad for the health of the component parts of your cartridge for a second. It just seemed to work via magic. You popped in your old copy of Legend of Zelda, and the screen stays black. You blow in it, the same. Damn. You proceed to blow in it again, even harder, and voila, you're in Hyrule. Cartridges still exist thanks to Nintendo, but they don't require anyone to blow in them, and it could definitely be frustrating. I remember blowing into some carts like 20 times before they'd work. But I do remember these cool moments where I felt so proud when there was a few of us trying to blow into a cartridge, and it was my breath that somehow magically got the cart to work. Well, that's going to do it for this video. I definitely probably missed a ton of old game experiences that I could have talked about. These are the ones that stood out to my mind. But please let me know, what is your favorite old gaming memory that younger gamers won't get to experience? And younger gamers, I have a question for you too. Please let me know what old gaming experience you are most thankful not to deal with. That will be a lot of fun to hear your opinion on. That's it for this video. Please like and subscribe, and don't forget to insert disc 3 to watch my next video. Game on.